The galaxy had known peace for 312 years. That was the number Admiral Tethvar of the Krellian hegemony recited every morning like a prayer. 312 years since the last major conflict between conclave species. 312 years since the Accord of Meridian was signed in blood and starfire. 312 years since anyone had dared point a weapon at another civilization and mean it. It was a good number, a comfortable number. Tethvar was beginning to think comfort was dangerous. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the KHS Eternal Patience, staring at a sensor report that had been delivered to him 40 minutes ago and had not improved with starring. His second officer, a young Krellian named Voss whose ridge crests had gone fully pale, stood 2 steps behind him and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The sensor buoys at the edge of the outer veil, those ancient, faithful watchdogs that had recorded little more than dust and dying stars for decades, had detected something. Not a comet, not a debris field, something moving at a velocity that made the instruments query themselves 3 times before reporting, because the reporting software had never been written to handle a number that large. The object was large, extremely large. It had no transponder signal. It answered no hailing frequencies. It did not appear on any registry in the Conclave's vast and meticulously maintained database of every ship, station, and structure built by every known spacefaring species in the last 4 centuries. It simply moved, steady, patient, enormous, like something that had decided where it was going a long time ago and saw no reason to explain itself to anyone. Tethvar turned to Voss. Dispatch Subadmiral Is in Scout Wing 14, standard intercept formation. Tell her to identify the vessel, establish communication, and determine intent. He paused. Tell her to be polite. Voss hesitated. And if they don't respond to politeness, sir? Tethvar looked back at the sensor display. The object had not slowed. It had not deviated. Whatever it was, it moved like something that had never once considered the concept of asking permission. Then tell her to be very polite. Subadmiral Is had commanded Scout Wing 14 for 11 years. She had intercepted rogue freighters, mediated border disputes, and once memorably talked a Velun merchant captain out of firing on a Conclave customs ship over a misunderstanding involving cargo manifests and 17 cases of fermented root paste. She was, by any measure, a steady officer, experienced, unflappable. She had never seen anything like this. The 3 frigates of Scout Wing 14 dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the designated intercept coordinates, and for a moment, just a moment, Is forgot to give any orders at all. Her crew forgot to follow any. Every face on the bridge turned toward the viewport, and every face wore the same expression, a kind of deep, wordless recalibration. The vessel ahead of them was black, not the dark gray of standard hull plating, not the iridescent black of Velun stealth coating, black, the absolute black of something that had been designed to absorb light, to give back nothing, to exist in space as a kind of deliberate absence. It was longer than anything Is had ever seen outside of a space station. Its hull was not smooth. It was layered, scarred, rebuilt in visible sections where different metals met at uneven seams, where repair plating had been welded over older damage in layers so thick they had become part of the original architecture. It had the look of something that had been destroyed several times and had simply refused to accept it. It had guns. Is was a military officer. She knew weapons when she saw them. What lined the flanks of this vessel were not the elegant, integrated weapons systems of Conclave frigates. They were brutal, external, purposeful things mounted in clusters, angled in overlapping fields of fire, some of them visibly newer than others, as if they had been added as the need arose, as if whoever built them had learned what they needed to kill, and then built the means to kill it repeatedly over a very long time. Is realized she was gripping the arm of her command chair hard enough to ache. She released it deliberately. She activated the hailing array. Unidentified vessel. This is Sub-Admiral Is of the Krellian hegemony, operating under authority of the Galactic Conclave. You have entered monitored space without prior registration or transit clearance. Please identify yourself, state your origin and destination, and reduce speed to allow for proper inspection. This communication is being broadcast on all standard frequencies and is being translated by Conclave Universal Protocol. Silence. The vessel did not slow. It did not acknowledge. It moved like a mountain that had learned to travel and had nothing to prove. Is broadcast again. Then again. She tried backup frequencies, emergency channels, old diplomatic bands that hadn't been used in a century. 43 minutes of silence passed, during which the enormous black ship continued its heading without any sign. It had noticed 3 Krellian frigates had positioned themselves in its path. Then the comm crackled. The voice that came through was human, though Is would not know that word for several hours yet. It was rough, tired, carrying the particular flatness of someone who had been awake for too long and had long since stopped performing alertness for anyone. The translation matrix took 4 seconds to find the language, which was 4 seconds longer than it had ever taken for any known conclave species. Krellian vessels. This is Commander Sierra Vasquez of the United Nations ship Unyielding Providence. We are reading your hails. We are on a direct transit heading to the Meridian Drift Trading Post on a diplomatic mission under emergency authority. We do not require escort, inspection, or assistance. We ask that you clear the lane. A pause, then almost as an afterthought, please. Is set her jaw. Commander Vasquez, your vessel is not registered in any conclave database. You do not have a transit clearance. I am required under Accord Law to. The Unyielding Providence moved. It did not accelerate aggressively. It did not power weapons. It simply adjusted its heading by 4 degrees, the minimum needed to pass around Scout Wing 14's formation, and continued on its way. The displaced space in its wake, the simple churning presence of that much mass moving at that speed, was enough. Frigate 3's navigation array went offline. Frigate 2 lost attitude control for 90 seconds. Frigate 1, Is's own ship, shuddered stem to stern, and every officer on the bridge grabbed something solid and held on. When the shaking stopped, Is looked at her viewport. The Unyielding Providence was already receding, still black, still steady, still utterly, terrifyingly unhurried. Is sat in silence for a long moment. Then she opened a channel to Admiral Tethvar and said 6 words that would echo through conclave chambers for years. Sir, we have a significant problem. Conclave High Council convened in emergency session within 18 hours of Sub-Admiral Is's report, which was, by conclave procedural standards, essentially instantaneous. Normally, the scheduling of an emergency session involved 3 days of formal requests, 2 days of representative travel, and at least 1 procedural objection from the Velun delegation about the font size of the agenda documents. The fact that all 17 species had their representatives seated and present in under a day said more about the collective state of conclave anxiety than any report could. Tethvar stood before them and delivered his briefing with the careful, measured tone of an officer who had spent the entire transit to Central Station deciding exactly how alarmed he was permitted to sound in a room of politicians. He was very alarmed. He kept it at a professional simmer. He showed them the sensor recordings. He showed them Is's visual footage, the black ship, the layered hull, the weapons clusters, the sheer scale of it. He showed them the spectral analysis, which indicated hull materials of mixed composition unlike anything in standard conclave metallurgical databases, some of it dense enough that the scan couldn't fully resolve the interior structure. He showed them the velocity readings, which 2 council members asked to have redisplayed because they assumed there was a unit conversion error. There was not. The chamber was very quiet when he finished. Then the questions began. 17 species, 17 sets of concerns, 17 different diplomatic vocabularies for expressing the same core emotion. Something large and unknown and heavily armed had just walked through their space like it owned it, and nobody had known it was coming. High Counselor Priva of the Archivian Compact, an ancient, soft-spoken species who had maintained the Conclave's historical records for longer than most other species had possessed writing, raised a careful tendril. "I would like to ask for time," she said, in the particular way that Archivians said things they considered serious. "Before we reach conclusions, give me access to the deep archives. Give me my team. I believe I have seen this language before." The council gave her 48 hours. She needed 31. The report Priva delivered was not long. It didn't need to be. Its brevity was, in its own way, the most disturbing thing about it. 187 years ago, a conclave survey vessel conducting a routine outer zone catalog had conducted a single-pass observation of a small, wet, unremarkable planet orbiting a yellow G-type star in a region so far from established trade routes it had no common name, only a coordinate designation. The planet had a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, extensive liquid water oceans, large land masses with varied biomes, and clear evidence of a technological civilization in the early industrial stage. Radios, combustion engines, early electrical infrastructure. The survey officer's assessment, filed in 12 minutes and never reviewed by a senior archivist, read as follows: Technological Development Index, pre-spaceflight. Projected FTL capability, 400-600 years minimum. Recommended action, standard observation flag, low priority. No contact recommended under non-interference protocol. The species had been given a catalog designation. They had been recorded as calling themselves. In the one radio signal the survey ship had intercepted and translated, humans. Low priority. No follow-up had ever been conducted. Priva set down the datapad and looked at the council with the expression of someone who had spent 31 hours in an archive room arriving at an unpleasant conclusion. "The vessel that transited our space," she said quietly, "was built by a species we assessed as pre-spaceflight less than 2 centuries ago. A species to which we gave no contact, no communication, no acknowledgement of any kind. A species that has, in the intervening years, not only achieved faster-than-light travel, but has apparently constructed warships of a class and capability we have no existing framework to categorize." The silence that followed was different from the silence after Tethvar's briefing. That silence had been the silence of shock. This was the silence of people doing mathematics they didn't like the results of. It was the Velun representative, a species not known for blunt speaking, who finally said what everyone was thinking. "How many of those ships do they have?" Priva folded her tendrils. "We don't know." "What do they want?" "We don't know." "Why didn't we know about them?" Priva's voice was very even, "Because we chose not to look." The unyielding Providence docked at Meridian Drift 3 days later under a standard diplomatic approach vector, moving with a slow, deliberate care that the station's traffic control operators would later describe as unexpectedly considerate, as if the crew were very aware of how large they were and were trying to be polite about it. The ship took up berth space intended for 4 vessels. It did not apologize for this. It offered to pay double docking fees, which Meridian Drift's harbor authority accepted with the particular enthusiasm of people who have decided that asking questions is someone else's job. Commander Sierra Vasquez requested a meeting with any available conclave representative. 3 representatives arrived, none of them the ones who had been scheduled to attend, because the ones who had been scheduled had found urgent reasons to be elsewhere and sent deputies, because seeing the sensor footage of that ship was different from standing 20 meters from it, and several senior conclave diplomats had decided that the difference was significant. Vasquez met them in a neutral conference room on the station's diplomatic level. She came with 2 officers and no weapons, or at least no visible weapons, which the Conclave security detail noted was not the same thing. She was tall by human standards and shorter than most Krellians, with close-cropped dark hair and a diagonal scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw with the settled permanence of something that had happened a long time ago and healed in a hurry. She wore a military dress uniform that had been carefully cleaned and carefully pressed, and was still visibly, irrevocably worn, the kind of worn that no amount of cleaning removes because it's in the fabric itself, in years of use and sweat, and the particular stress of being lived in by someone who never fully stopped working. She shook hands with each representative, a human greeting gesture the translation briefing had warned them about, with a firm, dry grip that lasted exactly as long as seemed appropriate and no longer. Then she sat down, folded her hands on the table, and said, "Thank you for meeting with me. I'll be direct because we don't have much time. I have information your conclave needs to hear. I also have a request. I'm hoping we can consider both." The lead representative, a young Archivian deputy named Vel who had been given this assignment 40 minutes ago and was doing his best, managed to ask the obvious question. "Commander Vasquez, where did you come from? How did you build that ship? We had no knowledge of your civilizations." Vasquez nodded, unsurprised by the question. "I know. We found your survey buoys eventually. We know what they recorded. We know what assessment was made." Something crossed her face, not quite bitterness, more like the expression of someone acknowledging a fact they have processed many times and have chosen not to make the center of their personality. "We didn't have the luxury of staying pre-spaceflight for 500 years. She paused. "We had a reason to go faster." Vel looked at her. What reason? For the first time since she'd entered the room, Vasquez looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical. It was the tiredness of a very long answer that she had given before and would have to give again, and that never got shorter no matter how many times she told it. "Have you," she asked carefully, "ever heard of the Riven?" The 3 representatives exchanged glances. The word appeared in none of their briefings, in none of the Conclave's databases. "No," said Vel. Vasquez nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already expected and had been dreading since before she left home. "Then we need to talk," she said, "and I need you to understand that everything you think you know about the safety of this galaxy, you're going to want to reconsider." Word Riven did not appear in any Conclave database. Vel's team confirmed this within hours of Commander Vasquez first speaking it. They searched under every phonetic variation, every possible translation quirk, every parallel term in xenolinguistic cross-referencing. They searched the deep archives that Priva's team had only just reopened. They searched old survey logs, abandoned research threads, the fragmentary records of civilizations that had gone quiet over the centuries and whose final transmissions had been cataloged but never fully translated. Nothing. The Riven did not exist, not in any record the Conclave had ever made, not in the memory of any species that sat on the High Council. 17 civilizations, thousands of years of combined recorded history, and not one whisper of a species that Commander Vasquez spoke of the way soldiers speak of things that have tried to kill them. That absence, Priva would later write in her formal record of these events, was the most frightening discovery of her career. Not the unyielding Providence and its incomprehensible weapons, not humanity's impossible ascent from muddy radio broadcast to faster-than-light travel in under 2 centuries. The absence, the silence where a name should have been, because in Priva's long experience, civilizations did not simply vanish from the galactic record by accident. They vanished because something removed them, and something that could remove a civilization from the memory of the galaxy. That was a different category of threat from anything the Conclave had ever considered. She requested a second meeting with Commander Vasquez, privately, without the deputies. Vasquez agreed immediately. They met in a small room deep in Meridian Drift's administrative section, The kind of room used for conversations that weren't meant to appear on official logs, though both of them were sharp enough to know that Conclave security services were recording every word. It didn't matter. Vasquez had not come here to hide anything. She had come here specifically so it could be recorded. Priva settled into a seat built for smaller frames and studied the human across from her with the particular attention of a species whose entire civilization was built around the collection and preservation of information. "You said the Riven erased civilizations," she said. "Before we go further, what does that mean specifically?" Vasquez opened a hard case data unit she'd brought and placed a physical storage drive on the table between them. She did not connect it to anything. It sat there like an offering or a warning or both. "Riven are a swarm intelligence," she said. "Not a hive mind in the science fiction sense. They're not a single consciousness distributed across many bodies. They're more like a culture that has selected for collective action so aggressively over so many millennia that individual decision-making barely exists at a practical level. Every Riven unit acts in coordination with every other. There's no leadership to kill, no capital world to threat, no treaty to negotiate. They don't negotiate. They don't want territory or resources in any way we can engage with diplomatically." She paused. "They want absence. They want the galaxy to be quiet, and they have been, very methodically, for longer than your conclave has existed, making it quieter." Priva was still. The civilizations that went silent over the centuries. Some of them, yes. Not all. Some species just failed or chose isolation or died from internal causes. But the ones on the outer edges, the ones that went dark fast with no distress signals, no refugee ships, no warning at all. Vasquez tapped the drive. "We found the remains of 4 civilizations in Riven-cleared space before we understood what we were looking at. After that, we started understanding very quickly." "Why didn't you contact us before now?" The question hung in the air. Vasquez looked at it for a moment before answering. "The first 20 years, we didn't know you existed. We barely knew we existed in any cosmic sense. We'd only had FTL for 11 years when the Riven found our outermost research station and removed everyone on it. All 43 people. No bodies, no wreckage, just a station with open airlocks and all the equipment still running." She said this in a flat, even tone. "We spent the next 5 years figuring out what had happened and trying to believe it. Then we spent the next 56 years fighting back." 56 years. Priva did the arithmetic without meaning to. Vasquez was perhaps 50 years old by appearance, which meant she had been born into a species already at war. She had grown up in it, had likely been shaped by it in ways no external assessment could fully capture. "And now," Priva asked. "Now the Riven have retreated. We pushed them back beyond the outer veil 4 years ago. It took everything we had, more than everything, honestly. We lost." She stopped, just for a moment, a single beat of silence that contained something enormous. Then she continued smoothly as if the pause had not happened. "We lost a great deal, but we held, we pushed them back." She looked at Priva steadily. "They will come back, not this year, probably not for another decade. But they will come back, and when they do, they won't be coming back for just us." She slid the drive a centimeter closer to Priva. "That contains our full tactical record of 61 years of engagement with the Riven, weapons analysis, behavioral patterns, swarm coordination models, the locations of every Riven-cleared system we found, the trajectory analysis our people have done on their likely return vector." She paused. "It also contains the names of our dead. I included that because I want whoever reads this to understand that what I'm bringing to your council is not theory. It's not a projection or a diplomatic leverage point. It's the record of what happened to us and the warning of what is going to happen to you." Priva looked at the drive. She thought about the survey report from 187 years ago, the 12-minute assessment, low priority, no contact recommended. She thought about the Conclave's 312 years of peace and how comfortable that peace had felt, and how thin it now seemed, a veneer of safety over a darkness that humanity had been bleeding into for 6 decades while everyone else enjoyed their comfortable number. She reached out and picked up the drive. "I'll present this to the full council," she said. "I'll request an emergency convening within 72 hours. Vasquez nodded. "Thank you. I make no promise about their response." "I know," a pause. "I'm not asking for promises, I'm just asking them to read it." The drive contained 4.3 billion names. That was the first thing the council members encountered when they accessed the human tactical record, not the weapons data, not the enemy analysis, not the star charts or the trajectory models. Vasquez had structured the file so that the first thing anyone saw was the memorial index. 4,300,000,000 and some hundreds of thousands of individual names, each one attached to a date, a location, and a service record. Some of the records were long, most were short. Some contained photographs, the human custom of recording faces, of insisting that individuals be visually distinct and individually remembered, which struck several council members as simultaneously strange and deeply unsettling in the context of a list this long. It took the average reader 8 minutes just to scroll through enough names to understand the scale of the number. It took the Velun representative, who had asked how many ships do they have just days earlier, approximately 4 minutes before she stopped scrolling and sat back and did not speak for a long time. The tactical data came after. And the tactical data was, in its own way, even more alarming than the memorial index, because the memorial index told you what humanity had paid. The tactical data told you what they'd paid it for. The Riven were real. They were documented, analyzed, cross-referenced, and understood in a detail that only 60 years of brutal empirical engagement could produce. The return trajectory Vasquez's analysts had modeled built from captured Riven signal intercepts and the mathematics of swarm behavior patterns, cut directly through the heart of conclave space, not the periphery, not the disputed outer zones, the center, established systems. Species that had never fired a weapon in anger in living memory. High Counselor after High Counselor read the data. Some read it fast, looking for errors, looking for the diplomatic angle, looking for the human motive behind the presentation. Some read it slowly, page by page. The way you read something when you're hopping the next page will say something different. None of the pages said something different. By the time the formal session opened, the council chamber had a feeling Tethvar had not experienced in 3 centuries of conclave history. Not panic. These were senior diplomats and military officers, and they had the discipline of their positions. But beneath the discipline, something old and animal and honest. The feeling of a species that has just been informed, very credibly, that the darkness has a name and a direction. The feeling of realizing that the peace was never yours to keep. Commander Vasquez had expected resistance to the tour request. What she had not expected was the particular nature of the resistance, not fear of the ship exactly, but a more complicated anxiety, the kind that comes when you're not sure whether seeing something will make it better or worse, and you're already not sleeping well as it is. In the end, 7 representatives agreed to come. 2 Krellians including Tethvar himself, 2 Archivians including Priva, an engineer diplomat from the Meridian Compact named Joss who had a reputation for remaining functional in the face of information that destabilized other people, and 2 observers from smaller species who had said very little during the council sessions, but had been watching Vasquez with the focused attention of people taking detailed notes in their heads. Vasquez met them at the docking lock personally. She had debated, briefly, whether to give them a stage tour, clean it up, manage the optics, present the ship in its best light. She had decided against it in about 40 seconds, because there was no version of this ship that looked like anything other than what it was, and she had not traveled this far to have anyone mistake what she was showing them. The lock opened, the smell hit first. It was hard to describe, metal and coolant and something organic underneath. The the smell of recycled air that had been recycled for a long time in an enclosed space, the particular musk of a vessel that had been continuously crewed through decades of operations without ever having the luxury of a full dry dock decommission. It smelled like a working ship. It smelled like a ship that had never stopped working. Tethvar's ridge crests did something complicated. He breathed through his mouth for the first 3 minutes and then adjusted, because he was a professional. Vasquez led them through the primary corridor of Deck 4, the ship's operational spine, and said almost nothing for the first 10 minutes. She had found, over the years, that the unyielding was better at introducing itself than she was. The corridor was wide enough for 5 humans to walk abreast, which meant 3 Krellians in their broader frames moved through it in a slightly sideways shuffle. The walls were not decorative. They were honest. Cable conduits ran exposed along the upper sections, labeled in at least 3 different handwriting styles accumulated over years of different maintenance crews. The floor plating was layered with mats in high-traffic areas, the edges sealed with repair tape in 4 different colors. Every door had both an electronic panel and a manual override handle, physical metal, bolted on in a fashion that suggested the manual override was not a regulatory requirement, but a lesson that had been learned the hard way. Joss, the engineer diplomat, stopped at the 3rd junction and put her hand on the wall, just placed her palm flat against it, and stood there for a moment. "Different materials," she said. "This section is different from the last one, different resonance." "Rebuilt," Vasquez said. "That section was a riven boarding breach in year 34. We lost the whole deck. When we replated, we used captured riven hull material mixed with our own. It's harder, a beat. We learned to use what we found." Joss took her hand off the wall slowly. She did not say anything else about the materials. They moved through the engineering section, where human crew members in gray coveralls nodded to the visitors and kept working, a detail Tethvar noted with the specific appreciation of a military officer. The fact that the crew had clearly been briefed not to stop and stare, to remain functional and professional, to present normalcy. It was a deliberate choice. It was also, he thought, a genuine reflection of a crew that simply did not have much capacity left for being impressed by strange things. One engineer, young, couldn't have been more than 25, with the particular tiredness of someone on hour 16 of an 18-hour shift, was running diagnostics on a secondary power coupling and humming to herself. She noticed the group, gave Vasquez a quick nod and went back to her work. Her hands never stopped moving. The weapons bay came next. Vasquez opened the bay doors and stepped back to let the delegation enter first, and there was a long moment where no one moved. Then Priva walked in, and the others followed, because someone had to go first. The bay held the maintenance cradles for the ship's secondary forward armament, 12 weapon systems in 2 rows of 6, each one longer than a Krellian scout ship, each one broken down to a degree that made their internal architecture visible. Tethvar had seen weapons his whole career. He had designed some. He understood the language of them, the grammar of construction and purpose. What he was looking at now was a different dialect entirely, not the elegant integration of Krellian weapons engineering, where form and function were considered together, and the result was something that looked purposeful and coherent. These weapons looked evolved. Each one was different from its neighbors. Each one had been modified, stripped, rebuilt in sections. One had a barrel assembly that was clearly newer than the rest of the weapon by at least a generation of manufacturing. Another had a cooling system that appeared to have been cannibalized from a completely different type of weapon and adapted, in a way that would have horrified a textbook engineer, to serve a function it was not originally designed for. "These don't match," Joss said. It was not a complaint, it was professional observation. "No," Vasquez agreed. "Early in the war we had standardization. We built things to spec. Then the Riven adapted to our specs, so we stopped standardizing." She looked at the row of weapons with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite grief and existed in the space between them. "Every time they adapted to what we were using, We changed what we were using. These weapons are 60 years of change. Some of them are solutions to problems we solved 20 years ago. Some of them are solutions to problems the Riven gave us last week. A pause. The Riven are very good at figuring out what you're using against them. They're less good at handling something they've never seen before. The medical bay was the last stop Vasquez had planned, and it was, in some ways, the most affecting. It was large, disproportionately large relative to the rest of the ship's layout, the kind of space allocation that reflected a specific and repeated need. It was clean in the absolute, clinical way of spaces where cleanliness is not aesthetic preference but operational necessity. It was also, and this was what stayed with Tethvar afterward, what he would find himself thinking about in the hours before sleep for weeks after, clearly designed for scale. Not just for treating a crew, for treating many people, fast, under conditions where the careful and unhurried procedures of peacetime medicine were not available. There were stasis pods along one wall, more than the crew's size would suggest. Vasquez noticed Tethvar looking at them. "We added those in year 12, she said. "Before that, we were losing people we could have saved if we'd had more time." She said it simply, in the tone of someone reporting a logistical lesson. "We added time." Tethvar had served in the Krellian military for 30 years. He had studied the military histories of every conclave species. He believed, professionally, that he understood war at a conceptual level, its costs, its demands, its permanent alterations to the people and institutions that survived it. Standing in that medical bay, he began to suspect he had understood it the way you understand water from a diagram of a molecule. On the way out, passing back through the main corridor, they encountered a section of wall near the forward lock that was different from the rest, not plated, not covered, just exposed base hull, and on that hull in small, precise handwriting were names. Hundreds of names. Written in marker in pen in what appeared to be at least 6 different languages and several different scripts, some of them faded almost to illegibility with age, some of them fresh and dark. No one asked what they were. Everyone understood what they were. Priva stopped and looked at them for a long time. She did not take notes. She did not record anything. She simply looked, with the expression of an archivist who has found something that every archive should have contained but didn't. When the delegation returned to the station, they did so mostly in silence. Joss, waiting for the boarding tube to cycle, said quietly to no one in particular, "They built that ship inside a war, while the war was happening. They kept changing it and adding to it and losing sections of it and rebuilding it, and they never stopped. For 60 years. No one answered her. The tube cycled open. They walked back into the clean, comfortable, carefully maintained station, and the air tasted different than it had before, lighter, and somehow less trustworthy. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when people are not merely surprised but fundamentally recategorized. When something they thought they understood turns out to be an entirely different object than the one they believed they were looking at. That silence fell over the conclave High Council chamber when Commander Vasquez finished her formal briefing. She had presented for 3 hours. No theatrics, no manipulative pauses or strategic emotional beats. Just data, delivered with the precision of an officer who had spent years making sure information moved accurately from the people who gathered it to the people who needed to act on it. Star charts with riven-cleared systems marked in gray, each one a civilization that no longer answered. Signal intercepts with translation notes attached. Tactical breakdowns of riven swarm behavior at various engagement scales, each one annotated with the specific year and battle that had generated the understanding. The trajectory model, displayed in full 3-dimensional projection above the center of the chamber floor, showing the riven's most probable return vectors like fault lines running through the heart of known space. When she finished, she set down her data interface, drank from the glass of water someone had placed in front of her, and waited. Counselor Dravax of the Velun Sovereignty, a species whose diplomatic tradition held that direct confrontation was a form of social failure to be avoided at nearly any cost, was the first to speak. "Commander Vasquez," he said, with the careful cadence of someone choosing every syllable, "what is it that you are asking of us specifically?" Vasquez looked at him. "I'm asking you to prepare for a conflict you have not yet confirmed will reach us. A conflict that has already erased at least 6 civilizations that we know of, that we have trajectory modeling for, and for which the return timeline is a decade at most." She paused, keeping her voice even. "With respect, counselor, the question of whether the Riven will reach you was answered before any of us were born. The only question is whether you're ready when they do." Dravax settled back. "And if we were to ask humanity to serve as our defense, given that you have?" "We can't." Vasquez's voice was not unkind, but it did not leave room for negotiation on this point. "I want to be very clear about this, because I've thought about how this conversation would go for a long time, and I don't want there to be a misunderstanding. We cannot defend the Conclave for you. Not because we won't, but because we are 4 years out of the most destructive war in human history. We have lost nearly a fifth of our population, our shipyards are operating at 30% capacity, and we are still treating veterans from engagements that happened 14 months ago." She paused to let that settle. "What we can do is teach you everything we know. Everything. Weapons design, tactical doctrine, Riven behavioral analysis, defensive installation architecture. Everything we learned in 61 years of getting it wrong and right and wrong again until we found the things that worked. We can give you that." Another pause. "But you have to be willing to build it." The chamber was quiet again. A different quality of quiet than before, the working quiet of people doing difficult arithmetic. It was Teth Var who broke it. He had not been scheduled to speak. He was a military advisor, not a council vote, but he stood anyway, and no one told him to sit down. "I toured the unyielding Providence yesterday," he said. "I've been in military service for 30 years. I've seen the best warships the Krellian hegemony and every other conclave species has built." He paused. "What Commander Vasquez has brought to this station is not a warship in the way we use that word. It is something that a civilization builds when it has been fighting for its life for longer than most of our officers have been alive. It is the accumulated answer to 60 years of a question that kept trying to kill them." He looked around the chamber. "We have the luxury of starting that education from the beginning. We have the luxury of learning without paying what they paid to learn it." His voice did not rise, but something in it changed, a weight settling, a decision already made that was looking for words. "I do not think we should waste that luxury." No vote was taken that day. Protocol required formal consultation periods, written submissions, independent legal review of any proposed military cooperation agreement. These things would take time. But in the corridors outside the chamber, in the small dining rooms and the communication alcoves of Meridian Drift, the representatives of 17 civilizations were already talking to each other in a different register than they had been 48 hours ago. Not the careful, diplomatic, "I have a position to protect" register of formal conclave proceedings. Something rawer. Something that acknowledged, quietly and privately, that the universe had just revealed a dimension they hadn't been accounting for, and that the accounting needed to begin immediately. Vasquez, for her part, spent the evening in the unyielding small officers' mess with her senior crew. They ate real food. Someone had managed to purchase fresh vegetables from Meridian Drift's hydroponic market, the first produce that hadn't come out of a reclamation unit in 4 months, and talked about nothing consequential. Repairs that still needed doing. Shore leave rosters. A running argument about a strategy game 2 of the officers had been playing for 6 months, that had apparently reached a state of such complexity that neither player fully remembered the original rules. Vasquez ate her vegetables and listened to her crew talk and felt the particular quiet that follows weeks of sustained tension, not peace exactly, but the temporary absence of immediate demand. The conclave would make its decision, or it wouldn't. The Riven would return on their own timeline regardless of any vote taken in any chamber. The future was the future, and it would arrive at its own pace. What mattered tonight was that they had made it here. They had crossed the distance. They had put the information in front of people who needed it. Her first officer, a careful man named Henrik who had been with her for 11 years, caught her eye across the table and gave her a small, tired nod. The kind of nod that doesn't mean anything specific and means everything that doesn't fit into words. She nodded back. Outside the viewport, Meridian Drift's lights reflected off the hull of the unyielding Providence, and the ship sat in its berth, scarred, rebuilt, impossibly large, and waited, as it had always waited, for whatever came next. The formal vote on the proposed Human Conclave Military Cooperation Framework was scheduled for the 31st day after Vasquez's initial presentation. It nearly didn't happen. The problem wasn't the Riven. The Riven data was compelling enough that no serious counselor tried to dispute its validity. 3 independent analytical teams from 3 different species had reviewed the tactical record and returned assessments ranging from credible to irrefutable, and the trajectory modeling had been confirmed by Conclave's own deep space sensor arrays, which had, once they knew what to look for, found evidence of Riven transit signals that had been sitting, unclassified, in passive monitoring archives for 11 years. The problem was the unyielding Providence itself. Because once the Conclave's military analysts, people who had spent their careers studying the carefully balanced force limitations of the Accord, had been given access to the hull's spectral data, the weapons assessments, and the structural schematics that Vasquez had provided as part of the transparency protocol, they had produced their own estimates, and those estimates made very uncomfortable reading. The unyielding Providence alone, by their best reckoning, outgunned the combined standing fleet of 9 of the Conclave's 17-member species. Against the full Conclave fleet, it was closer, but humanity had built more than one ship. That much was clear from the tactical record. How many more was the question no one had an answer to, and the question that was keeping several council members awake in a way that had less to do with the Riven than it perhaps should have. Councillor Brathine of the Teshan Cooperative, a species that had a long, complicated relationship with military power and the entities that possessed it, put the concern directly in the 31st day session. We are being asked to enter a partnership with a species that is, by current assessment, a military power of a category the Accord was specifically designed to prevent any single species from reaching. We have only their word that their intentions toward the Conclave are cooperative. We have no verification mechanism. We have no enforcement framework. We are being asked to trust. It was not an unreasonable point. Several other councillors nodded. Vasquez had been granted observer status at the session. She was not supposed to speak unless invited. She was invited, pointedly, by the Archivian delegation who recognized that whatever she said in the next 5 minutes would probably determine the outcome of the vote. She stood. Councillor Brathine is correct, she said. I want to acknowledge that directly because I think it would be dishonest to dismiss the concern. She paused. We are a military power of a scale that your Accord did not anticipate. We reached that scale because we needed to survive, not because we wanted strategic advantage over anyone in this room. But I understand that my saying so is not verification. I understand that trust is not a policy. She let that sit for a moment. So here is what I can offer, beyond my word. We will accept inspection rights, conclave observers with full access to our shipyards, our production records, and our strategic command documents, permanently, for the duration of any cooperation framework. We will accept a joint command structure for any combined operations, with conclave officers holding equal authority at all engagement levels. We will place our weapons technology in a jointly administered trust rather than transferring it bilaterally, with all conclave species having equal access. She looked around the chamber. We will do these things not because you demanded them, but because we understand that a galaxy in which one species holds a decisive military advantage over all others is unstable, and an unstable galaxy is a galaxy the Riven can exploit. A pause, quieter. We didn't survive 61 years to become the next thing the rest of you have to be afraid of. The vote, when it came, was 14 in favor, 2 abstaining, and 1, the Teshan Cooperative, voting against with a formal reservation that was logged and acknowledged and did not change the outcome. The Human Conclave Military Cooperation Framework passed. The first human technical mission arrived at the Krellian hegemony's primary shipyard at Vethara Station 42 days after the framework was signed. There were 9 of them, humans in gray and blue work coveralls, each one carrying a personal kit bag and a data case, and seemingly a constitutional inability to stand still. They were led by a chief engineer named Dara Os, who was shorter than any Krellian on the reception dock, and who looked at the shipyard's main construction bay, 3 kilometers long, currently building 2 Accord-class frigates, with the expression of someone doing rapid, involuntary, and not entirely polite arithmetic. The Krellian shipyard master, senior engineer Kelvreth, had been building warships for 35 years. She was proud of her facility. She was prepared to be respectful of the human engineers. She was not prepared for Osai to turn to her within 5 minutes of the tour beginning and ask in a tone of genuine professional curiosity, "What's your hull integrity protocol for high-repetition weapon stress cycles?" Kelvreth explained their hull integrity protocol. Os listened attentively. She nodded. She did not say anything immediately dismissive, but the pause before she started asking follow-up questions was exactly long enough for Kelvreth to understand that the answer had been inadequate in ways she was about to learn. The next 8 months were the most demanding of Kelvreth's professional life. They were also, she would admit decades later, the most educational. The humans did not take over. That was the thing that surprised her most, and surprised most conclave engineers who worked with the technical missions across the 17-member species. They did not arrive with a blueprint and say, "Build this." They arrived with a philosophy and said, "Here is why things break. Here is what we learned about keeping them from breaking. Here is what we tried that didn't work and what we tried that did." They asked questions constantly. They wanted to understand Krellian materials science, Krellian manufacturing tolerances, Krellian crew physiology, and how it affected ergonomic requirements. They adapted everything they taught to the species they were teaching. What emerged from the Vethara yards 8 months later was not a human ship. It was not a Krellian ship either, exactly. It was something new, a vessel that incorporated 6 decades of human hard-won doctrine into a framework built around Krellian strengths and Krellian ways of working. It was heavier than any Krellian warship ever built. Its weapons were arranged in overlapping coverage patterns that Krellian aesthetic tradition would never have produced, but that Riven engagement data made obviously necessary. Its medical bay was larger than standard. Its hull had redundancies on its redundancies. When Kelvreth first walked the completed ship's corridors, she found herself thinking of the unyielding Providence, not because this ship looked like it, but because she could feel the same philosophy in its bones. The philosophy of a vessel designed not to be elegant but to survive, to keep fighting, to bring its crew home even when everything had gone wrong. She named it KHS Remembered, the first in what would become the hegemony's new resilience class. Similar scenes were playing out across conclave space. At Archivian orbital platforms, human engineers worked with species whose entire civilization was oriented around information preservation to design ships that could keep records and transmit data even under extreme combat damage. Because one of the most valuable resources in fighting the Riven, as the human record repeatedly demonstrated, was knowing what happened, so that those who came after would not repeat the same expensive mistakes. At Velun construction facilities, humans who had spent careers building weapons were sitting in rooms with pacifist tradition engineers who had never designed anything intended to harm anyone. And the conversations were difficult and uncomfortable, and ultimately produced some of the most inventive defensive systems the Framework's Joint Review Board had ever seen, because the Velun engineers, freed from military tradition's assumptions about what a weapon must look like, solved problems in ways no military tradition would have attempted. The Teshin Cooperative, which had voted against the framework, watched all of this from the outside. Their reservation had been formally logged. Their decision was respected, but their own deep space monitoring arrays were running the Riven trajectory analysis that Vasquez had provided. All Conclave members had received the data as part of the transparency protocol, and their senior defense analysts were filing internal reports that used increasingly urgent language. 6 months after the framework passed, the Teshin Cooperative formally requested observer status at a joint tactical exercise. 3 months after that, they submitted an application for full membership in the framework. Councillor Brathine submitted a formal amendment to the session record, updating the Teshin Cooperative's vote from against with formal reservation to in favor with formal prior reservation noted. It was, under conclave procedural tradition, an unusual document. Several archivists noted they had never seen one before. Priva, reviewing it in her records office, thought it was probably the most honest thing the Teshin Cooperative had ever submitted to the record, a species admitting in its formal and procedural way that it had been afraid and that it had changed its mind. She filed it carefully. These things deserved to be kept. The Riven came back 9 years and 4 months after the unyielding Providence docked at Meridian Drift. They came back differently than anyone had expected, and exactly as everyone had feared. Not through the outer veil, where the sensor network had been rebuilt and expanded and refined over nearly a decade of joint conclave human engineering work. Not along the return trajectories that Vasquez's analysts had modeled, though those vectors had been correct. They came back along all of them, simultaneously, a coordinated emergence at 7 points across the edge of known space, each point chosen to stretch the response and complicate the coordination, each wave timed to arrive within 40 minutes of the others. In the old conclave before the framework, that timing would have worked. 17 species, 17 separate command structures, 17 different communication protocols and response doctrines and definitions of emergency. 40 minutes would not have been enough to coordinate anything. Individual fleets would have responded individually. Some would have held, some would not. The waves would have separated them and reduced them and moved inward. The Riven, it was clear from the tactical pattern, had planned for the conclave they had observed from a distance. They had studied the sensor data their advanced scouts had gathered over years. They had built a plan for a galaxy of comfortable, separate, uncoordinated civilizations. They had not planned for what the conclave had become. Commander Vasquez was not on the unyielding Providence when the alert came. She was at the Joint Tactical Command Center on Meridian Drift. She had been stationed there for 6 months as the human representative to the framework's operational command structure, a role she had taken because her ship's crew had earned rest and because someone needed to be in the room where the decisions were made. The alert came in at 3:47 station time. 7 contacts. Riven signal signatures confirmed by the new detection arrays, the hybrid human Archivian design that could read Riven coordination signals at twice the range of any previous system. 40 minutes. The joint command structure activated in 11 minutes. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. There were arguments and communication failures and moments where the friction of 17 different species trying to operate as a single military organism created delays that Vasquez's internal calculus said they couldn't afford. But it activated. 17 species command representatives in the same room, or connected to it, with the same data within 11 minutes. The framework's emergency response protocol distributed tactical assignments in the next 7. The fleets were in motion in 22 minutes, with 18 to spare. Vasquez stood at the central display and watched the plots move: human ships and Krellian ships and Archivian ships and Velun ships and Teshan ships, and the ships of species whose names she had only learned to pronounce correctly in the last 3 years, all moving together, all running the same tactical doctrine, all built to the same philosophy of survive, hold, bring your crew home. Tethvar, standing at her right, watched the plots in silence for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "The Riven are adjusting. They weren't expecting." He paused. He turned to look at her. "They weren't expecting us." Us. The word landed in a way that Vasquez would remember for the rest of her life. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical weight, but with the simple, solid resonance of something true. "No," she said, "they weren't." The battle at what would later be named the 7 Points lasted 11 hours. It was not clean. Battles never are, and this one less than most. The Riven adapted, as they always did, and the adaptations cost lives and ships in the way adaptations always did, because there is no doctrine so perfect that reality doesn't find its seams. The KHS Remembered took catastrophic damage in the 3rd hour defending the Outer Vale Junction and had to be evacuated. 3 human ships were lost entirely at Point 4, when the Riven committed a concentration of force that the tactical models had assessed as low probability. Several Velun and Meridian ships were destroyed in the final push at Point 7, and their crews died in the cold the same as anyone dies in the cold, which is to say completely and without exceptions for species or civilization or the quality of one's intentions. The dead were recorded, every name. That protocol had been written into the framework's founding documents, at Vasquez's insistence, because the unyielding Providence had names on its walls, and she believed, with the conviction of someone who had spent a lifetime paying for the lesson, that the dead deserved to be counted. But the line held. All 7 points held. The Riven waves were met, disrupted, fractured. The swarm's timing advantage, the window they had calculated would separate and overwhelm individual responses, closed in the face of a coordinated fleet that had not existed 9 years ago. The Riven's battle logic, calibrated against a divided galaxy, encountered something its advanced scouts had not reported. A galaxy that had had 9 years to grieve its separateness and decide to try something different. At 14:23 station time, 6 hours after the last contact, Conclave sensor arrays confirmed that Riven transit signatures were withdrawing on all 7 vectors. The Joint Command Center was quiet for a moment. Then several things happened at once, in several different registers, some species representatives expressing relief in loud, physical, demonstrative ways, others in silence, others in ritual gestures that no one else in the room fully understood but everyone recognized as meaningful. Tethvar stood very straight and pressed his right fist to his left shoulder in the Krellian gesture for a battle survived. Priva sat down in her chair and closed her eyes. Brathine of the Teshan Cooperative, who had voted against the framework and then changed his mind and spent 9 years working harder than almost anyone to prepare his species for this day, put his face in his hands for a moment. Not weeping, exactly, just occupying the fullness of the moment without performing anything about it. Vasquez stood at the display and watched the Riven signatures recede. She thought about the unyielding out there, somewhere, in its battle damage, waiting. She thought about 43 people in a research station with open airlocks, 61 years ago, who had been the first to learn what the universe contained. She thought about 4 billion names, and about all the names from today that would be added to them. She thought about the survey report, 12 minutes, low priority, no follow-up. She thought about what it meant that humanity had been alone at the edge of everything, and had held, not because anyone was watching, not because anyone was coming to help, but because there was nothing else to do. And she thought about what it meant that they weren't alone now. Someone on the communication array was asking for a status report. Someone else was requesting a damage assessment from Point 4. The business of surviving was already transitioning, as it always did, into the business of continuing, the long, ordinary, necessary work of repair and record and readiness. Vasquez straightened. She picked up her communication interface. She had reports to file and calls to make, and people who needed information and decisions that only she could make. The war was not over. It had never been and might never be, and everyone in this room understood that now in a way they hadn't 9 years ago. But they understood it together. She opened the first channel and began. Somewhere in the outer veil, the UNSC Unyielding Providence held its position in the dark between stars, scarred from the day's fighting, one engine running at reduced capacity, its medical bay busy with people who would mostly survive. On the wall near the forward lock, in the light of a corridor that had been rebuilt 6 times and would be rebuilt again, 4 billion names waited to be joined by new ones. The galaxy, for the first time in its long memory, had fought as one. It had been enough. Today, it had been enough. And